As you may already know by now, international borders can be complicated. If you need proof of this, watch parts 1 and 2 of this series if you haven't already. Speaking of previous episodes, I actually wanted to start off part 3 of the series by addressing some changes that have happened relating to some of the borders I talked about in parts 1 and 2. In episode 1, I talked about the border between India and Bangladesh, easily the single most complex international border in the world, with nearly 200 enclaves, 24 of which are second order enclaves and the world's only third order enclave, part of India inside Bangladesh, inside India, inside Bangladesh. Crazy stuff. Now, in 2011, both governments agreed to sort out the enclaves, but when I released part 1 of the series back in 2013, still nothing had been done. However, that has now changed. In 2015, the transfer of enclaves finally happened. Tens of thousands of people who were living in a state of limbo, who basically had no government, were allowed to choose citizenship of either of the two countries. So India and Bangladesh now have a completely normal border, and the world's only third order enclave is gone. From a geography lover's perspective, it is a little bit sad, but in reality it's a very positive thing since 50,000 people were effectively trapped inside these enclaves, unable to live a normal life. Now moving on, but still sticking with borders from previous episodes, in episodes 1 and 2 I talked about unclaimed land, Bir Tawil between Egypt and Sudan in part 1, and the parcels of unclaimed land caused by the river Danube between Croatia and Serbia. Well, both these lands have since been claimed. 2 micronations have been established. In Africa, an American man claimed Bir Tawil as the Kingdom of Northern Sudan. In Europe, the largest parcel of land has been claimed by a Czech man and established the Free Republic of Liberland. Like most micronations, these 2 newly established countries lack any sort of international recognition, with most sovereign states saying they have no legal grounds to claim the lands. It does beg an interesting question, legally speaking. Do they have a right to claim the land? Yes, the land is technically unclaimed, but on the other hand, it could be argued that it's an ongoing border dispute and that the land technically does belong to one of the countries, it just hasn't been determined which one at the moment. Okay, that's enough about previous episodes, let's look at some new borders now. Continuing with tradition, let's look at some enclaves and exclaves. There are still some that I haven't yet covered. First, we're going to look at Spain. Now, Spain actually has 3 separate exclaves, one of which is enclaved by France and another 2 by Morocco. The Spanish town of Yevia sits just 1,500 metres from the Spanish-French border and is completely surrounded by France. The reason this small town, with a population of less than 2,000, is Spanish and not French is basically because of a technicality in a treaty back in the 1600s. In 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees, which put an end to the Franco-Spanish War, ceded to France all villages north of the Pyrenees. Now, Yevia is north of the Pyrenees, however it was technically considered a city because historically it had been the capital city of Cerdanya, a county of Catalonia. So today in the 21st century, this small town remains Spanish because a treaty 350 years ago considered it a city because it had been a capital city of a county of a principality which came into existence 900 years ago. So moving on to Africa, just across the Strait of Gibraltar where we find Ceuta, surrounded by Morocco. Historically, Ceuta had been a strategically important naval base dating back as early as the Carthaginian Empire in the 5th century BC. It changed hands many times throughout history and was actually destroyed in 1740, but later re-established in the 9th century. Before becoming a Spanish territory, it was actually Portuguese. It was conquered from the Kingdom of Fez in 1415. This can still be seen today as the flag of Ceuta uses the coat of arms of Portugal. In 1580, Spain and Portugal were united under the Iberian Union as Portugal had a succession crisis as their king died without any heirs. This lasted until 1640 and the Portuguese Restoration War, which ultimately led to Portuguese independence. However, Ceuta remained loyal to Spain, and in the 1668 Treaty of Lisbon, the exclave was ceded to the Spanish Empire. Moving on to the other Spanish exclave of Melilla. The exclave has a somewhat similar history to Ceuta in that it was settled millennia ago and has changed hands several times throughout history. Melilla was conquered by the Spanish in 1497, although at the time it was actually under Portugal's zone of influence. The Portuguese, however, allowed the Spanish to attempt to conquer it, which they did with very little resistance. Ever since the conquest, Morocco has made several unsuccessful attempts to take the city, believing it to be rightfully theirs. After a brief war between Spain and Morocco in 1859, which was decisively won by the Spanish, Morocco recognised the Spanish sovereignty over Ceuta and Melilla. The city limits of Melilla were also defined that year, and it was decided that the way in which it would be done would be to fire a cannon from Spain's fortress and measure how far away it landed. The cannonball landed 2,900 metres away from the castle, and that would determine the border between Morocco and the Spanish exclave of Melilla. Morocco would later be colonised by Spain in the scramble for Africa in the Berlin Conference of 1884. However, after Morocco's independence in 1956, Spain held on to their two Spanish exclaves, claiming them to be an integral part of Spain. Morocco still claims both exclaves to this day. Let's look at another border now, and what was probably the most requested in the comment section of the last two videos: the Kaliningrad Oblast. The Kaliningrad Oblast is part of Russia that is separated from the mainland. It has a coast on the Baltic Sea and is bordered by Lithuania and Poland. By land, you would need to travel through two countries to get to the Russian mainland. So how did the border end up like this? For this, we need to go back to 1871 and the unification of Germany. The German Empire, the Second Reich, was mostly dominated by the Kingdom of Prussia, which made up 62% of the nation's population and 64% of its land area. After Germany's defeat in World War I, the Treaty of Versailles ceded much of Germany's lands to bordering nations. East Prussia became an exclave as it became separated from the rest of the nation. In the aftermath of the war, the kingdom was abolished and became the Free State of Prussia. This only lasted until 1933 though, as the Nazi Party took control. After the Nazis were defeated in World War II, however, Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin demanded that East Prussia be split between Russia and Poland. The exclave came into existence with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, when the bordering nations became independent, leaving the Kaliningrad Oblast separated from the rest of Russia. All surrounding nations have introduced strict border controls since joining the EU. Moving on from enclaves and exclaves now, as we travel to Africa and the country of Namibia. The country has a somewhat unusual shape, as it has a long salient or panhandle extending eastwards. This is called the Caprivi Strip and, unsurprisingly, has its roots in colonial European times. Modern day Namibia was a former German colony, German Southwest Africa. Germany acquired the Caprivi Strip in a deal with Great Britain, and its name comes from the German Chancellor who negotiated the acquisition, Leo von Caprivi. The idea behind this was that Germany wanted access to the Zambezi River, which would give them a route to the east of Africa. Unfortunately for Germany, this plan had one major flaw. See, just 60 kilometers or so down the Zambezi River is the world's largest waterfall, Victoria Falls. So the Zambezi River was found to be not navigable, and Germany's plan for a route to the east was thwarted. However, despite this, and despite Namibia since becoming part of South Africa and then fully independent in 1990, the Caprivi Strip remains. The population of the strip of land are ethnically and linguistically different from the rest of the country, and there is even a separatist movement with their own rebel group, the Caprivi Liberation Army. Sticking with Africa, as we look at the next border, an international border that has only existed for a few years, the border between Sudan and South Sudan. Having previously been the same country, South Sudan achieved its independence in 2011, but a border dispute remains. The region of Abyei was given a special administrative status, and as such is considered to be simultaneously part of Sudan and South Sudan. Back when Sudan was a condominium between Britain and Egypt, Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, it was administered as two separate north and south provinces. The politics were heavily dominated by the north, and the south had very little representation. This continued throughout the independence of Sudan and led to a civil war and eventually the independence of South Sudan. A peace treaty was signed in 2005 which stated that an independence referendum would take place after 6 years. The referendum was nearly unanimously passed with almost 99% voting in favour of independence. Another referendum for the region of Abyei was originally scheduled to take place at the same time. However, to this day it has still yet to take place due to various complications and disagreements, and therefore is still stuck in a state of limbo and the special administrative status that it was given as a temporary solution. The region has been controlled by Sudan since 2012. Now this next complex border is actually not even on land, but on a lake, Lake Constance, between Germany, Austria and Switzerland. On this lake, there basically are no international borders. The borders between these nations simply stop at the shoreline because no treaty exists as to where exactly the borders are. Austria believes the lake to be a condominium, i.e. the lake is simultaneously part of all three countries. Switzerland, on the other hand, believes the international borders simply pass through the centre of the lake. Germany doesn't really have an opinion on the subject, and any legal disputes which may arise are simply handled on a case-by-case basis. The final border I'm going to look at, and part of the world that has yet to be featured in this complex border series, South America, and the border between Chile and Argentina. Now these two countries have a massive natural border between them, the Andes mountain range, and should therefore have no problem deciding where their border is. Right? Well, both these countries gained their independence from the Spanish Empire in the early 19th century, but it wasn't until the Boundary Treaty of 1881 that the official border was to be established. However, what seemed like a fairly straightforward treaty turned out to actually cause a border dispute between the two nations. The treaty stated that the border between Chile and Argentina would be the peaks of the Andes mountain range which divide the water. The division of the water referring to water that flows to the Atlantic versus water that flows to the Pacific. The problem though was that the treaty stated two separate stipulations, the peaks of the Andes and the division of the water. The treaty assumed these two things to be the same. It assumed that all water west of the Andes would flow to the Pacific, while all water to the east would flow to the Atlantic. However, this turned out not to be the case. Rivers can and do erode through mountains over many years, and the Andes is no exception. Therefore, some rivers that were west of the Andes would flow to the east and vice versa. So this created a border dispute between the two countries, while both countries simply claimed whichever gave them the most territory. The dispute had to be settled by a neutral party, and this was to be the British King, King Edward VII. So Chile and Argentina, two countries which have two naturally occurring boundaries between them, the division of the waters, and one of the largest mountain range in the world, have a border which follows neither. Thanks for watching.